in May 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed under the weight of its own destruction and Allied forces pushed across a dying Europe. An American armored division made an extraordinary discovery on a quiet railway siding in the Austrian village of Laufen. There, resting on a flatbed wagon like a forgotten relic of a fallen empire, sat a massive Mercedes 770, its body riddled with bullet holes, its armored glass fractured into webbed patterns, its once imperial presence reduced to a wounded monument. The soldiers who approached it had no idea they were standing before one of the most controversial artifacts of the war, a vehicle whose true identity would be buried beneath rumor, assumption, and error for nearly 4 decades. In the chaos of victory, the car was hastily labeled, casually misunderstood, and unknowingly set on a path that would confuse historians, collectors, and even national institutions. Only years later, through meticulous research and the obsessive pursuit of truth, would the real story behind this enigmatic machine be uncovered. This is the mystery behind Hitler's missing Mercedes. Asterisk. The origins of this extraordinary machine trace back to the late 1930s. Inside the precision-obsessed workshops of Daimler-Benz, where German engineers were tasked with designing a vehicle that would not merely transport the leadership of the Third Reich, but physically embody their authority, paranoia, and obsession with invincibility. What they produced was the Mercedes-Benz 770 W150, an engineering behemoth that transcended the idea of a luxury car and became a rolling fortress. Conceived at a time when the Nazi regime sought to project absolute power both at home and on the world stage, the 770 was built to intimidate, to impress, and above all, to protect. Weighing over 4 tons, wrapped in thick armor plating, and powered by a supercharged straight-8 engine capable of moving this mountain of steel at speeds approaching 150 kilometers per hour. The car was an overbuilt answer to a single question: how do you keep a dictator alive? Its windows were composed of nearly an inch of bulletproof glass, heavy enough to require special mechanisms just to raise and lower them. Its doors were fortified to resist rifle fire. Concealed compartments held machine pistols in case the occupants needed to return fire. Every bolt, hinge, and panel was designed not for beauty or efficiency, but for survival. And while these vehicles were reserved for the most elite figures of the Nazi hierarchy, Göring, Himmler, and other high-ranking officials, there was one 770 that stood apart, crafted with subtle but deliberate differences that made it unmistakably unique. This was the car built for Adolf Hitler himself. Hitler's personal Mercedes 770 was not simply another armored limousine in the Nazi motor pool. It was a deliberately customized machine, engineered with subtle but unmistakable details, that would one day become the key to solving a mystery that lasted nearly 4 decades. While high-ranking officials such as Göring and Himmler rode in similar 770 models, Hitler's car carried unique identifying features that set it apart from every other W150 ever built. At the front, the radiator grille contained an ornamental opening found on no other vehicle. Below the windscreen sat a row of 4 narrow ventilation slots that altered the car's profile in a way only a trained eye would notice. The door hinges followed a distinctive pattern that differed from the standard production layout. Even the side windows were unique, shorter in length and gently curved in a shape specially ordered for the dictator. Most striking were the 20 cooling slits along the bonnet, arranged 10 per side of the central hinge, a configuration exclusive to Hitler's personal vehicle. These details formed a mechanical fingerprint, a signature of authenticity encoded directly into the steel. Yet in the confusion of the war's final weeks, as Germany collapsed and its leadership scattered, no one was paying attention to slits, vents, or window shapes. These defining characteristics were overlooked, forgotten, and swallowed by the chaos of a regime in free fall. Because of that moment of oversight, the most infamous car of the Third Reich would disappear into history, hidden in plain sight for almost 40 years. As the Third Reich entered its final, desperate days in April 1945, the carefully maintained order that once defined Nazi Germany dissolved into chaos. Soviet forces closed in on Berlin from the east. British and American armies pressed in from the west, and what remained of Hitler's shrinking circle retreated to the mountain stronghold of the Obersalzberg near the Austrian border. This alpine complex had long served as Hitler's retreat, a place where he hosted foreign dignitaries and planned military operations, and as the Reich collapsed, it became a temporary vault for valuables, documents, and personal possessions hurriedly evacuated from the capital. Among the items moved in those frantic final weeks was Hitler's Mercedes 770 SS personnel, loaded the massive vehicle onto a railway flatbed with unclear intentions. Perhaps it was meant to be hidden. Perhaps they planned to move it deeper into the mountains. Or perhaps, in the frenzy of a collapsing regime, it was simply following an order that no longer made sense. Whatever the plan had been, the Mercedes never reached its destination. As Nazi command structures crumbled and units scattered, the flatbed carrying the car was abandoned on a quiet stretch of track in the small Austrian village of Laufen, just north of Salzburg. There it remained, silent and unattended, while the world around it fell apart. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th. Germany surrendered days later. And on that lonely rail siding, the dictator's once prized limousine sat forgotten, reduced to just another artifact of a dying empire waiting to be rediscovered by the advancing Allies. When American forces finally pushed into the village of Laufen in early May 1945, the war in Europe was effectively over, yet isolated pockets of German resistance still fought on. Sergeant Joe Azzara and his squad from the U.S. 20th Armored Division moved through the narrow streets expecting a routine sweep, but instead they encountered one last burst of defiance. German soldiers, whether acting out of fear, confusion, or blind loyalty, opened fire. A brief but intense firefight erupted, echoing through the village with the sharp crack of rifles and the heavy thump of American return fire. When the shooting ceased and the streets fell quiet, Azzara's men began their search for weapons and intelligence, unaware that they were moments away from uncovering a historical puzzle that would linger for nearly 40 years. As they moved toward the railway siding, something immediately caught their attention. Resting on a flatbed wagon was an enormous black Mercedes unlike anything they had seen. Even through the grime of combat, the car radiated presence. Its massive armored doors were pocked with bullet strikes. The rear protective plate showed clear signs of having taken direct hits. The windshield was fractured in 3 distinct places, each impact leaving a spiderweb of cracks spreading across the thick bulletproof glass. The right passenger window was splintered but still intact, a testament to the strength of its heavy laminate layers. Azzara and his men climbed onto the flatbed to get a closer look. Inside, the dashboard bore a fresh bullet indentation. The soldiers managed to locate fuel and coax the engine to life, and though it eventually roared awake, it ran rough, coughing and shaking as if wounded by the same violence that scarred its exterior. As they examined the car, a Dutch forced laborer emerged from a nearby garage. Speaking in broken English, he told the Americans that this vehicle belonged to Hermann Göring. The claim made perfect sense to men who had just spent months fighting the Nazi hierarchy. Göring was known for his extravagance, and such a grand vehicle seemed to fit his taste. Without any reason to question the statement, the Americans accepted it as fact. In that moment, a simple misidentification was born, one that would shape the car's story for decades to come. In the days that followed its discovery, the massive Mercedes quickly shifted from battlefield curiosity to a useful asset in the hands of the occupying American forces. Still believing the car to be Hermann Göring's personal vehicle, the U.S. Army repainted the once gloss black body in a utilitarian green, added white Allied stars to its sides, and pressed it into service as transportation for high-ranking officers navigating the fractured remains of the Third Reich. The battered limousine, still bearing its bullet scars and splintered glass, became an unlikely symbol of victory as it rolled through ruined German cities carrying American brass instead of Nazi officials. By late summer 1945, with Germany defeated and attention turning toward the Pacific Theater, the Army recognized that the car could serve another purpose. It was shipped across the Atlantic to support the final push of the war effort through war bond drives. At public events across the United States, crowds gathered to see what was advertised as Göring's captured Mercedes, a tangible trophy of the Allied triumph. Spectators marveled at the bullet holes and shattered windows that spoke of a dramatic final confrontation, never knowing the true history concealed beneath the misidentification. Once the Bond tours ended, the car lost its public value and was quietly placed into long-term military storage, where it would sit for nearly a decade, largely forgotten. In 1956, amid a sweeping effort to clear surplus assets, the U.S. military sent the Mercedes to auction at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Again labeled as Göring's car, it was purchased by Canadian collector H.J. O'Connell, who saw an opportunity to restore and preserve what he believed was a significant wartime relic. This began the next chapter in the car's journey, a chapter that brought new life, new mistakes, and an even deeper layer of confusion to a story that was already drifting far from the truth. O'Connell wasted no time arranging for the newly acquired Mercedes to be shipped to Rumble Motors in Toronto, where he commissioned an extensive restoration. The car had endured a violent end to the war and a decade of storage, and its condition reflected every bit of that history. Body panels were warped from gunfire, mechanical components were worn or seized, and the once elegant paint was dulled by grime and neglect. Yet beneath the damage, O'Connell saw what he believed to be Hermann Göring's personal limousine, and he was determined to return it to its former prestige. The restoration team worked methodically, repairing bullet strikes, straightening metal, rebuilding the engine and refurbishing the interior with careful attention to detail. One deliberate choice, however, set this restoration apart. O'Connell instructed the team to leave the shattered and bullet-scarred windows untouched. He understood their historical value and believed the damage added authenticity. Those fractured panes would later become some of the most visually striking clues to the car's identity. Preserved exactly as the Americans had found them in 1945, yet while much of the restoration work remained faithful to the car's original condition, one crucial addition inadvertently altered its historical fingerprint. Using photographs of other Mercedes 770s owned by Nazi officials, the restoration team installed a center-mounted spotlight on a curved bar above the front bumper. This feature appeared on several leaders' cars and seemed appropriate for a vehicle associated with Göring. The team had no reason to suspect that Hitler's personal car never carried such a fixture. This seemingly minor modification introduced another layer of confusion, reinforcing the belief that the car belonged to Göring and complicating any future attempt to identify it correctly. For more than a decade, O'Connell proudly displayed the restored Mercedes, exhibiting it at shows and private events where its imposing presence and preserved battle scars captivated audiences. Then, in 1970, he offered the vehicle to the Canadian War Museum in exchange for a tax deduction. The museum, confident in the car's documented provenance, accepted it as Göring's personal limousine and placed it on display. Visitors filed past the massive vehicle, reading the placard and believing they were looking at a piece of history tied to one of the most notorious figures of the Nazi regime. None suspected that the entire story was wrong, and that the truth waited quietly in the shadows. Noticed only by a single librarian with a very keen eye, Ludwig Koscher, a reserved and meticulous librarian at the Canadian War Museum, was not the kind of person one would expect to rewrite a piece of World War II history. Yet from the day the Mercedes arrived, something about the vehicle unsettled him. Koscher had grown up in Germany and possessed an instinctive familiarity with the era's machinery and iconography. He began noticing small inconsistencies that most visitors and even most museum staff overlooked. The arrangement of the cooling slits, the curvature of the rear windows, the placement of the vents beneath the windscreen, details that did not align with what he knew of Göring's documented cars. These differences were subtle, but they were enough to spark a quiet suspicion. Rather than dismiss his doubts, Koscher allowed them to grow into a private investigation. In his spare hours, he returned repeatedly to the exhibit, studying the vehicle with increasing scrutiny. He pored over archived photographs, newsreels, and technical manuals, comparing every known image of Nazi leadership vehicles to the car sitting in the museum's collection. The deeper he delved, the more convinced he became that something was very wrong with the accepted story. Kosha did not seek recognition or confrontation. He sought accuracy. What troubled him was not the possibility of a dramatic revelation, but the idea that thousands of visitors were being told an incorrect version of history. And as his research progressed, a new and far more astonishing possibility began to emerge. The museum's prized Göring car might not have belonged to Göring at all. In fact, it might be connected to someone far more significant. Kosha's quiet curiosity soon evolved into a full investigative pursuit. Determined to uncover the truth, he began by thoroughly documenting the physical details of the car itself. He photographed every angle, measured distinctive components, and recorded features that seemed unusual or inconsistent with known Göring vehicles. One discovery in particular stood out: the factory serial number stamped into the engine firewall. If any definitive proof existed, it would be linked to that number. With this clue in hand, Kosha reached out directly to Mercedes-Benz in West Germany, hoping the company might still possess manufacturing records from the 1940s. While awaiting a response, he turned his attention to another critical piece of evidence. The car still retained its original German license plate, though faded and partially obscured by wear. Through careful lighting and photographic enhancement, Kosha managed to read the numbers clearly enough to include them in his research. Weeks later, a reply arrived from Mercedes-Benz that changed everything. Not only did they still have the production records for the vehicle, but the information they provided matched the mysterious museum car with absolute precision. Every custom feature, every deviation from the standard design, aligned perfectly with one specific order placed during the war. Kosha now had a credible lead, but he needed official confirmation. He contacted the West German embassy, providing them with both the serial number and the plate information. Their response was definitive and astonishing. The car did not belong to Hermann Göring. According to the archives, the plate and serial number were registered to Adolf Hitler himself. The revelation hit the Canadian War Museum like a shockwave. For nearly 40 years, curators, historians, and visitors had accepted without question that the imposing Mercedes on display once belonged to Hermann Göring. Now, through the persistence of a single librarian, that long-held belief collapsed. The official confirmation from both Mercedes-Benz and the West German embassy left no room for doubt. The serial number, the factory specifications, and the license plate all pointed to one indisputable truth. The car had been delivered to the Reich Chancellery on July 8, 1940, for the personal use of Adolf Hitler. Suddenly, every detail that Kosha had questioned took on new meaning. The curved rear windows, the 20 cooling slits, the unique door hinges, the ornamental grille opening, each feature matched. The custom order placed for Hitler's 770 and no one else's. The discovery transformed the vehicle from an interesting Nazi artifact into one of the most historically significant automobiles in existence. The museum updated the exhibit, altering the placard and documentation to reflect the car's true identity. Almost immediately, public interest surged. Journalists requested interviews, historians re-examined archival material, and crowds flocked to see the car they now understood as Hitler's personal parade vehicle. Preserved largely as it had been found in 1945, yet the reattribution also stirred fierce debate. Some argued that displaying the car risked glorifying one of history's most infamous dictators. Others insisted that hiding or destroying it would be an evasion of the past, a failure to confront the physical evidence of a brutal regime. The museum chose a middle path, keeping the car on display, but embedding it within a broader, educational context that addressed the crimes of the Nazi government. The dangers of authoritarianism, what had once been misidentified as a trophy of victory, had become a sobering reminder of the power, fear, and delusion that shaped the Third Reich. The mystery of Hitler's missing Mercedes ultimately became a story far larger than an abandoned car or a decades-old clerical mistake. It revealed how easily history can bend under the weight of chaos, rumor, and assumption, especially in the final days of a collapsing regime. A single misidentification made on a war-torn railway siding had echoed for nearly 40 years, shaping museum exhibits, influencing public understanding, and obscuring the truth about one of the most infamous vehicles ever built. Yet, it also demonstrated how fragile those errors can be when confronted by patience, curiosity, and a commitment to evidence. Ludwig Koscher's determination to question what others had taken for granted stands as a reminder that historical truth is rarely handed to us intact. It must be pursued, examined, and sometimes fought for. Today, the Mercedes remains on display not as a relic of Nazi grandeur, but as a stark educational artifact. Its shattered windows and armored panels reflect both the violence of the era and the layers of misunderstanding that later surrounded it. Visitors can look at the car and see not a symbol of power, but a physical reminder of how myths form, how they persist, and how they can finally be dismantled. In a world where information spreads instantly and is often accepted without scrutiny, the journey of Hitler's missing Mercedes offers a timeless lesson. The truth may be buried, distorted, or forgotten, but it is never beyond reach for those willing to look closely. Ask difficult questions and follow the evidence wherever it leads. Asterisk.